Tonight we begin with the scandalously legendary life of Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen whose intellect was as sharp as her eyeliner and whose political maneuvers were only slightly less famous than her rumored bedroom exploits. But before we unravel this royal roller coaster, take a second to subscribe to this channel, because you're not going to want to miss any of the brilliance, drama, or bathtubs full of donkey milk we dive into every week. Let's begin with the Tammies. A royal family so committed to keeping the bloodline pure, they basically replaced a dating pool with a gene puddle. Cleopatra was born into this gloriously dysfunctional dynasty, where marrying your brother wasn't just legal. It was practically a baby shower tradition. Her father was Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Oryx or the flute player, which historians agree was a polite way of saying terrible king. Okay, at parties, when Daddy Dearest died, Cleopatra did what every ambitious royal girl boss in a politically unstable, incest-friendly monarchy does. She married her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was around 10 years old. Cleopatra was in her late teens. So yeah, not so much a marriage as it was a hostile corporate merger with a toddler. Naturally, this joint rule went downhill faster than a chariot with one wheel. When Cleopatra got a little too independent, Ptolemy's regents decided she was no longer needed. The solution? Exile. Because nothing says healthy sibling relationship like being forcibly yeetated into the desert. But Cleopatra wasn't the type to sit around and sulk. She got herself smuggled back into Alexandria by being rolled up in a carpet. Yes, an actual carpet. This wasn't just an entrance. It was a theatrical middle finger with fringe. Julius Caesar, who was conveniently in town for a war and probably bored, unrolled her like a birthday surprise, and immediately decided she was worth backing. Politically, allegedly. The result, a civil war, several dramatic drownings, and Cleopatra's brother-husband conveniently vanishing into the Nile, like a wet accident that no one really investigated too hard. Once she was back on the throne, Cleopatra married her next younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, because apparently she was working her way down the sibling ladder like a royal bingo card. He too died under unclear circumstances, which in ancient royal terms usually means poison, betrayal, or a very suspicious accident involving figs. Yes, she ruled Egypt. Yes, she wore the outfits. Yes, she styled her eyeliner like a walking eye of Horus. But ethnically, culturally, linguistically, she was about as Egyptian as a toga party at a fraternity house. Cleopatra was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who was rewarded with Egypt after the empire awkwardly broke apart like a group project. After the leader drops out, the Ptolemies move in, brought their wine, their language, and a complete refusal to speak Egyptian. For nearly 3 centuries, not a single Ptolemaic ruler bothered to learn the local tongue. You'd think after 300 years, someone would have picked up a low. But Cleopatra, she was different. She reportedly spoke at least 9 languages, including Egyptian. That's not just smart, that's flexing. It's like being the only person in a Zoom meeting who actually read the memo and then doing a whole call in the intern's dialect just to be polite. This gave her a massive political advantage. While her ancestors ruled from the palace, Cleopatra went out among the people, embraced their gods, and even styled herself as the reincarnation of Isis. Not in a subtle, humble, bragging way either. She had temples. She had coins. She was like, I am the goddess. Now, please pass the eyeliner and call me divine. But let's not pretend this was all spiritual. Cleopatra knew branding. Egypt was full of priests, traditions, and people who liked their monarchs God-lavered. By leaning into the local religion, Cleopatra wasn't just showing off. She was locking in support from the powerful priesthood and getting bonus loyalty points from the public. It was genius, really. The Greeks thought she was Greek enough. The Egyptians thought she was Egyptian enough. And the Romans, they thought she was trouble with a capital seductress. Cleopatra didn't just run Egypt. She practically ran a multilingual customer service hotline while doing it. According to ancient sources, she spoke 9 languages, which in the ancient world was just showing off. Most monarchs struggled to speak one language well, usually Greek, and relied on interpreters to do the heavy diplomatic lifting. Cleopatra, she was the interpreter. She could chat with Ethiopians, debate with Hebrews, negotiate with Parthians, and most importantly, talk circles around smug Roman politicians in their own tongue. If Caesar ever thought she was whispering sweet nothings, she might have just been listing military strategy, in which general's haircut was a national embarrassment. Among her repertoire, Egyptian, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Parthian, Median, and a few others that now only show up on dead language bingo cards. And yes, she was the first in her Macedonian Greek family to even bother learning Egyptian despite ruling Egypt for centuries. The previous Ptolemies acted like Egypt was just a big hot Airbnb. But Cleopatra wasn't just multilingual. She was strategically multilingual. She knew that nothing wins hearts faster than speaking directly to the people. Whether she was addressing priests, diplomats, or spice traders with suspicious mustaches, Cleopatra had a linguistic tool belt ready. If she were alive today, she'd run circles around Google Translate, and she'd do it in heels. And let's be honest, when you're juggling siblings, Romans, assassins, and the occasional god complex, it's very handy to be able to insult someone fluently in 9 different tongues. She could probably switch from sweet-talking to soul-crushing mid-sentence without skipping a beat. Imagine a tense negotiation. The Roman envoy makes a snide remark. Cleopatra pauses, smiles politely, and replies with something immediate that translates to, "Tell your Senate I'm unimpressed, and your toga needs ironing." Mic drop. Multilingual mic drop. This wasn't just about diplomacy. It was about power. Cleopatra used her words like weapons, sharp, precise, and always delivered with a perfectly timed eyebrow raise. In a world where most rulers needed translators, Cleopatra needed an audience. And while the Romans loved to call her a sorceress, what really terrified them was that she could argue, negotiate, and flirt, all without letting them know who was actually in charge. Spoiler, it was her. Yes, the legendary Pearl Incident, a moment in ancient history where wealth, ego, and chemistry came together for the world's most bougie science experiment. The story comes courtesy of Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer known for documenting everything from volcanoes to the lifespan of elephants with varying degrees of accuracy. But if this one is true, and let's pretend it is because it's hilarious, Cleopatra once made a bet with Mark Antony that she could host the most expensive banquet in history. Mark Antony, the Roman general who could conquer armies but not common sense, called her bluff. Cleopatra calmly accepted the challenge, as one does when you're bored and have access to half the GDP of the ancient world. The next day, she brought out a simple meal. Nothing outrageous. Mark Antony raised an eyebrow. This the most expensive feast in history. It was practically a Caesar salad without the branding. Cleopatra, unfazed, then produced one of her legendary pearl earrings, enormous, flawless, and worth a literal kingdom, and casually dropped it into a goblet of vinegar. Ancient vinegar, mind you, was strong enough to clean a chariot axle, dissolve bad decisions, and apparently pearls. With a little patience and a lot of dramatic flair, the pearl dissolved more or less in the acidic concoction. Cleopatra then drank the entire thing. Yes, she drank a priceless pearl on purpose with eye contact. The second earring that was reportedly saved before she could chug it, too. Likely by someone who suddenly realized they didn't want to be remembered as the servant who let their queen drink jewelry. Was this science? Technically, yes. Calcium carbonate in pearls does react with acetic acid. Was it sanitary? Highly doubtful. Was it Cleopatra cementing her place as the undisputed queen of drama, spectacle, and financial flexing? Absolutely. In one act, Cleopatra didn't just win a bet. She made a statement that to her priceless objects were drink garnishes. That Rome conveyed Egypt, but it could never outlure her. And poor Mark Antony, he lost the bet. So, you think your skincare routine is high maintenance because you use a jade roller and 3 types of serums? Cleopatra would laugh. Then bathe in donkey milk and apply crushed beetle mascara before turning you into an incense stick. Let's start with the infamous donkey milk baths. Yes, you read that right. According to ancient sources, Cleopatra bathed in sour donkey milk regularly. Not goat, not almond. Donkey. Why? Because it contains lactic acid, which gently exfoliates the skin and apparently leaves you glowing like a demigod. She allegedly kept hundreds of donkeys on standby just to keep the milk flowing. Imagine being a royal donkey in ancient Egypt. You don't carry grain. You don't haul bricks. You just lactate for the queen's bubble bath. What a resume! But she didn't stop there. Cleopatra's beauty arsenal included gold-infused face masks, coal eyeliner made of lead, and lip stains derived from crushed ants and carmine beetles. Because nothing says royalty like smearing insects on your face and pretending it's glamorous. Her perfumes custom-made, her wigs imported and styled, her nail color hennied to perfection. Cleopatra turned beauty into statecraft, and her entire appearance was a weapon. She didn't just wear makeup. She weaponized allure like a general wields a sword. And of course, there were ointments, oils, and pastes. She was big on almond oil, rose water, and frankincense resin. Basically, if it grew, oozed, or shimmered, it was going on her face. Ancient Eve must have loved her. The royal tab alone could pay for a pyramid's foundation. The point was not to be pretty in a modern sense. Cleopatra used beauty like a tactician. Every drop of donkey milk, every smoky eye, every perfumed breeze was designed to control the room, and occasionally the entire Roman Republic. Her presentation wasn't vanity. It was policy. Now imagine being a Roman envoy, stepping into her golden barge as she floats down the Nile, dressed like Isis, perfumed like a garden, and staring at you through 3,000 years of goddess cosplay. You'd probably sign the treaty and hand over your passwords. So yes, her beauty routine could bankrupt a small nation, but then again, so could Cleopatra. When Julius Caesar first laid eyes on Cleopatra, he was not expecting to find a queen rolled up in a carpet like a surprise party favor. But Cleopatra didn't do boring entrances. She invented the dramatic reveal centuries before reality TV and trapdoors. It was 48B.C., and Caesar had just walked into the middle of a royal mess. Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's younger brother and not-so-charming co-ruler, had tried to edge her out of the throne. Cleopatra, rather than sending a scroll or hiring a lawyer, smothered herself into Caesar's palace hidden in a rug. Talk about portable charisma. When the rug unfurled and out came the Queen of Egypt, regal, perfumed, and entirely unbothered, Caesar probably did what any seasoned Roman general would do. Blinked a few times, tried not to look stunned, and then promptly fell under her spell. And make no mistake, Cleopatra wasn't just seducing a man. She was recruiting an empire. The two struck up a partnership that was equal parts romance and statecraft. Cleopatra needed Roman muscle to stabilize her rule. Caesar needed Egyptian grain, naval access, and let's be honest, an exotic scandal to spice up his otherwise toga-heavy resume. They sealed their alliance the old-fashioned way. A private Nile cruise with military escort, excessive luxury, and a full-scale reenactment of "Look how rich we are." Cleopatra hosted Caesar on a barge so ornate it made Roman senators nervous, just thinking about the tax implications. There was music, there were feasts, there were political plots being whispered over goblets of wine, while crocodiles lounged ominously nearby. It was less of a date and more of a soft coup with snacks. Naturally, the two had a child, Caesarion or Little Caesar, though he came without pizza. This created quite the scandal back in Rome, where Caesar was already married and not supposed to be fathering foreign monarchs. But Caesar didn't care. He even put a golden statue of Cleopatra in a Roman temple, just to really ruffle the feathers of conservative senators, because nothing says subtle like deifying your mistress in public. Their affair didn't last forever, but it was enough to reshape the power dynamics of the ancient world. Cleopatra proved that she could play the Roman game and win without ever setting down her wine. When Cleopatra gave birth to her son with Julius Caesar, she named him Ptolemy the 15th Philipter Caesar. But because that sounds like a Greek accounting firm, most people just call him Caesarion, which roughly translates to Little Caesar. Yes, she literally named her kid after the most powerful man in Rome. And no, there was no pizza involved, although there was probably enough drama to cover the next 10 family reunions. Now, imagine being Caesarion. Your mother is Cleopatra, your father is Julius Caesar, and your destiny is whatever happens when two history-shaping supernovas collide and make a baby. That's a lot of pressure for someone who probably just wanted to play with crocodile toys and throw olives at servants. From the moment he was born, Caesarion was branded as the son of God and goddess. Not figuratively, literally. Cleopatra was styling herself as Isis, and Caesar was already being worshipped like a deity in Rome. So yes, Caesarion was divine by default. Try topping that at career day. Cleopatra pushed his legitimacy hard. He wasn't just her son. He was her co-ruler. He was officially titled King of Kings despite being barely old enough to hold a scepter without chewing on it. Meanwhile, in Rome, things were tense. Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as a son, possibly because admitting you had a royal Egyptian heir while running a republic full of angry senators was not a great career move. Spoiler alert, it didn't help him anyway. The Senate stabbed him 23 times. Caesarion's claim to fame was now possibly divine, definitely fatherless. As he grew up, Cleopatra paraded him as the future of a combined Roman-Egyptian empire, which was as subtle as declaring war via parade float. She minted coins with both their faces, dressed him in full regalia, and introduced him as a true heir of Julius Caesar, which, in case you're wondering, infuriated Caesar's Roman heir Octavian, soon to become Augustus. This would not end well for Caesarion, but Cleopatra wasn't playing for small stakes. Her entire strategy rested on building a dynasty that could outlive Rome's backstabbing politics. And Caesarion, he was a golden ticket, or at least a toddler with the most weaponized baby photos in history. If Cleopatra had an Instagram, her yacht photos would break the algorithm. This was not a woman who half-assed her nautical aesthetics. While Roman generals were sailing around in clunky warships that looked like oversized bathtubs, Cleopatra was floating down the Nile like a living myth on a barge that practically glowed. Let's talk about that boat, the one she famously used to meet Mark Antony in Tarsus. Ancient sources describe it like something out of a fever dream. The sails were dyed purple, which in the ancient world was basically the color of I'm richer than you and your grandchildren. The OES were coated in silver and beat time to the rhythm of music. Perfume wafted across the river so thickly that you could probably smell her arrival before you even saw the mast. The deck draped in gold. The queen dressed as the goddess Isis, lounging under a canopy like she was both hostess and celestial being. Musicians played, incense burned. The Nile probably blushed. And then there's Mark Antony standing there on the docks like a schoolboy who forgot his homework and suddenly realizes he's on a date with someone who brought an orchestra and glitter bombs. Cleopatra didn't just arrive. She descended by boat. This wasn't just theatrical excess. Cleopatra understood image better than most modern influences. The barge was a floating propaganda machine. Her goal wasn't a flirt. It was to remind Antony and everyone watching that she was no regional queen. She was Egypt. She was divine. She was bringing perfume to a sword fight and winning. Even the Romans, famously allergic to glamour, were both horrified and mesmerized. Plutarch couldn't shut up about her entrance. It was Cleopatra's way of saying, you may have the Senate, but I have sequence strategy and a Senate entrance that hits harder than your legions. And let's be honest, it worked. Antony went from Roman war hero to Cleopatra's part-time cuddle prince. Her boat had that kind of power. If Cleopatra had a thing for Roman men with power, questionable politics, and a flair for drama, then Mark Antony was basically her type on papyrus. After Julius Caesar exited the world in a flurry of daggers and Latin shouting, Cleopatra found herself widowed in the most inconvenient way possible and politically exposed. So what did she do? She looked around for another Roman with ambition, military might, and the decision-making skills of a tipsy centaur. Enter Mark Antony. Antony wasn't exactly a subtle man. He once tried out Drink a Mountain, and his toga game was rumored to be aggressively short, but he was powerful, popular with the troops, and clearly vulnerable to dramatic women with boats. Cleopatra invited him to Alexandria. He arrived ready for diplomacy. He stayed for the wine, luxury, and let's be honest, Cleopatra's wildly effective seduction technique, which included pretending she was literally a goddess. From there, things escalated quickly. Cleopatra gave Antony twin children. He gave her the eastern half of the Roman Empire. You know, typical couple stuff. But back in Rome, the Senate was clutching their togas in horror. Antony was already married to Octavia, sister of Octavian, soon to be Augustus, and abandoning her for Cleopatra was less passionate romance and more international scandal with olive pits. The two lovers didn't just whisper sweet nothings. They hosted a club of inimitable livers, which sounds like a liver disease support group, but was actually their luxurious drinking society. Members wore costumes, held wild feasts, and reportedly tried to outdo each other in ridiculous stunts. Cleopatra once bet she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single dinner, dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar, and drank it just to prove she could. Yes, we already covered that, but honestly, it bears repeating. Eventually, Antony declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, as Caesar's true heir, basically writing Octavian's political obituary in glitter. Octavian responded by accusing Antony of being enslaved by an Eastern temptress, because obviously Roman men are never responsible for their own decisions. It's always the woman's eyeliner. What followed was a slow march to war, a legendary lover's downfall, and the ultimate ancient its complicated relationship status. But until the bitter end, Cleopatra and Antony ruled like gods, loved like stars, and partied like their empire didn't have an expiration date. Before there were celebrity perfumes clogging duty-free shelves, there was Cleopatra, ancient Egypt's original fragrance influencer. But unlike today's pop stars hawking odor, sweat, and ambition, Cleopatra's perfumes were serious business. She didn't just slap her name on a bottle. She built an empire literally. Let's start with a house of perfume, in Engi near the Dead Sea. Cleopatra is believed to have either owned or financially supported this perfumery complex, which specialized in exotic fragrances brewed from plants, resins, and whatever else made people smell like a well-oiled deity. Archaeologists have uncovered distillation vats, jars, and press tools. Basically the ancient version of a celebrity fragrance lab, minus the Instagram filters. Her favorite scent, Mandesian perfume. A spicy cinnamon-heavy blend that allegedly made Roman senators weak at the knees and eunuchs reconsider their vows. This wasn't your average bathhouse cologne. It took months to make, aged like fine wine, and was probably expensive enough to require a small dowry just to sample it. Cleopatra wasn't just bathing in this stuff. She was soaking in it from head to toe. Historical sources say she drenched her sails in perfume before arriving to meet Mark Antony. Because, of course, what's a seductive entrance if it doesn't involve the Nile River catching a whiff of cinnamon and surrendering? But this wasn't just about smelling good. In ancient Egypt, perfume was power. Fragrance wasn't just a beauty routine. It was sacred. Gods had signature scents. Priests used perfume in rituals. Cleopatra wasn't playing at luxury. She was weaponizing it. Perfume was her divine calling card. And let's not forget the seduction angle. Cleopatra understood something every decent villainess in cinema knows. If you walk into a room and it smells better because you did, you've already won. Combine that with her golden barge, divine wardrobe, and linguistic prowess, and Cleopatra became not just a queen, but a sensorial experience. Yes, you heard that right. While Caesar was conquering Gaul and Antony was nursing wine hangovers, Cleopatra was out here writing a beauty manual. Because why not rule a kingdom, run a navy, seduce emperors, and become the world's first beauty guru? Cleopatra's cosmetic book, now lost to time, and probably Roman censorship or some sweaty monk who didn't know how to handle papyrus, was said to contain recipes for skincare, hair dye, perfumes, and even treatments for baldness, which may explain why Julius Caesar stuck around. And this wasn't just some vanity project. In the ancient world, cosmetics were medicine, magic, and political theater all rolled into one. A smoky eye wasn't just sultry. It was protection from the evil eye and UV rays. Lip color meant status. Hair oil was both sensual and hygienic, or at least less terrifying than the alternative. Cleopatra wasn't gatekeeping either. The book was reportedly scientific, drawing from Egyptian, Greek, and even Indian traditions. She was mixing crocodile dung with honey, like some unholy ancestor of goop, a royal alchemist with eyeliner. And while today's influencers worry about being canceled, Cleopatra was handing out DIY eyeliner recipes involving burnt almond paste, animal fat, and powdered lead. Sure, It might give you a glow and also maybe lead poisoning, but beauty is pain, especially in 40 BC. The book also dabbled in aphrodisiacs because Cleopatra understood the true power of a well-placed pomegranate seed. If you're starting to think this all sounds like a myth, nope. Roman authors like Galen and Pliny referenced her concoctions. Her formulas were studied, copied, and whispered about in elite circles for generations. You know you're iconic when your lip balm recipe survives into the Xantine era. Why did she write it? Probably because she was clever enough to know that controlling your appearance was another form of power projection. Looking divine helped sell the idea that you were divine. Cleopatra didn't leave beauty to chance. She had a manual. Sadly, the book didn't make it past the bonfires of history. But somewhere out there, in the ashes of Alexandria's library, Cleopatra's ancient Sephora catalog still lingers, smelling faintly of rose water and ambition. Ah, ancient royalty, where the phrase human trials didn't come with medical oversight, but with a suspicious tray of figs and a shrug. Cleopatra, ever meticulous planner and occasional death-curious scientist, allegedly conducted poison experiments, not on lab rats, but on actual prisoners. Let that sink in. While modern queens worry about public approval ratings and waving correctly, Cleopatra was apparently out here trying to figure out which toxin killed most gracefully. Hemlock too slow. Wolfsbane too dramatic. Snake venom. H promising, but let's keep testing, according to Roman sources, and they loved a bit of slander with their storytelling. Cleopatra ordered prisoners to be given various poisonous substances and carefully observe the effects. The goal, not sheer cruelty, at least not entirely, but to determine the most painless and aesthetically tidy method of death. Because if there's one thing worse than dying, it's doing so messily in front of Roman invaders. Some toxins caused convulsions, others disfigured. One made a man giggle before dropping dead, which probably made for some confusing post-mortem paperwork. Cleopatra took notes, and not in a casual interesting way. She was reportedly dead serious, no pun intended, about choosing her own elegant exit strategy. This wasn't just about death, either. Poison, like perfume, was another tool of power, whether to take out a rival or to make sure your final scene is Oscar-worthy. Cleopatra wanted to be informed. She wasn't going to leave her legacy in the hands of a poorly cooked fish or a clumsy assassin. Now, were these stories exaggerated by Roman chroniclers? Maybe the Romans had a habit of turning complex women into cautionary tales. But given Cleopatra's keen intellect, scientific curiosity, and need to stay 5 moves ahead of her enemies, it's not entirely out of character. So, yes, while other monarchs were testing wine for flavor, Cleopatra was testing belladonna for balance. Who else could run a country in a live-action toxicology lab at the same time? History might raise an eyebrow, but Cleopatra just wanted options. After all, if you're going to die, might as well do it beautifully, silently, and with the same theatrical control she used to run empires and sail perfume-scented barges. Ah, yes, the grand finale. The image that launched 1,000 Renaissance paintings and just as many Cleopatra-themed Halloween costumes. The Queen of Egypt reclined on a silken couch, nolly pressing an ASP. Except that whole snake to the boob story might be more fiction than fatal fact. Let's break it down. The ASP theory comes mostly from Roman historians, the same guys who thought describing Cleopatra as a seductive villainess was more fun than admitting she was smarter than most of their Senate. According to them, she smuggled a venomous Egyptian cobra into her chamber in a basket of figs, because nothing says royal suicide like healthy snacking, let it bite her, and died gracefully without a scratch, mess, or awkward face contortion. Very tidy, very dramatic, very unlikely. Let's talk logistics. Cobras are notoriously uncooperative. They don't travel well in baskets. They don't always bite on command. And if they do, the venom takes hours, even days, to fully work. That's not ideal when you're planning a synchronized suicide with 2 loyal handmaidens. Imagine waiting around like, did it get me? Do I look pale yet? Some historians argue Cleopatra may have poisoned herself instead, using one of the fast-acting formulas she tested on those unfortunate prisoners. See Chapter 12 for that delightful bit. Something like hemlock or a brew of opium and wolfsbane would have been faster, cleaner, and easier to control. Not as cinematic, sure, but far more practical. Then there's the Roman angle. Octavian, later known as Augustus, had a lot to gain from making Cleopatra's death look like her own tragic choice. It wrapped things up neatly, avoided a messy public execution, and let him parade her orphaned children around as trophies without looking like too much of a villain. But what if she was murdered, slipped something, or quietly helped along by one of Octavian's men? We'll never know. If history is written by the victors, then Cleopatra's press coverage was basically a smear campaign written in all caps by some very bitter Romans. After her death, Octavian, soon to become Augustus, emperor and full-time grudge holder, had a problem. Cleopatra wasn't just some foreign queen. She was a political player, a threat to Roman power, and worst of all, a woman who didn't know her place. And Rome really didn't like that. So what did Octavian do? He rewrote the story. In his version, Cleopatra wasn't a scholar, strategist, or multilingual diplomat. Nope. She was reduced to a manipulative seductress who used sex like statecraft and probably bathed in perfume and lies. And Mark Antony, just a hapless man under her foreign spell, because clearly no powerful Roman man could be into her for any reason other than sorcery. It's honestly impressive how thoroughly Rome tried to erase or twist her legacy. Her children were marched through the streets in chains. Her writings, including her book on cosmetics, vanished from history. Temples dedicated to her were repurposed or destroyed. Statues crumbled, papyri burned, and her image was warped into little more than an exotic footnote in someone else's story. And yet, she persisted. Despite Rome's best efforts, Cleopatra refused to disappear. She survived in whispers and artwork, in the oddly detailed complaints of Roman historians. Plutarch, Cassius, Dio, and Suetonius all had opinions, wildly biased, of course. But even their attempts to discredit her left behind fragments of her brilliance. It's like trying to cancel Beyoncé and ending up boosting her album sales. The irony is rich. In trying to erase her, they accidentally immortalized her. Rome buried Cleopatra under scandal and myth. But they also ensured she'd be remembered forever, because you don't get erased from history. You get martyred in it. And Cleopatra, she became the blueprint for every femme fatale, every seductive queen, every woman blamed for a man's downfall with eyeliner on point. When Cleopatra died, snakebite, poison, or assisted Roman defenestration, she didn't just leave behind a crumbling empire and a very confused Octavian. She left behind a legacy that somehow evolved into a myth, then a symbol, and eventually a Hollywood spectacle wearing more eyeliner than armor. History forgot half the facts, twisted the rest, and filled the gaps with drama, scandal, and eyeliner wings sharp enough to assassinate an emperor. Over the centuries, Cleopatra became whatever each era needed her to be. To Roman writers, she was a dangerous seductress, the foreign temptress who made good Roman men go weak at the toga. In medieval texts, she was a warning against female power, the femme fatale archetype before that term even existed. The Renaissance loved her as a tragic romantic heroine, because who doesn't enjoy a well-lit noble suicide? Then came Shakespeare, who decided she needed even more drama. So he gave her sweeping monologues, epic betrayals, and a flair for the melodramatic exit. Elizabeth Taylor's version upped the budget, the cleavage, and the cinematic pauses, transforming Cleopatra into a camp icon, complete with gold-plated shoulder pads and enough costume changes to bankrupt an empire. But through it all, the real Cleopatra kept peeking through. Scholar, ruler, linguist, Navy commander, beauty brand founder, pharmaceutical experimenter, mother, lover, power broker. She became a canvas for every generation's anxieties and fantasies. A woman of immense complexity, distilled into an ever-evolving icon. Sometimes saint, sometimes sinner, always unforgettable. Her name alone evokes images of seduction, strategy, and that ever-elusive thing called power, all wrapped in silk, gold, and a knowing smirk. And perhaps that's the point. Cleopatra isn't just a historical figure. She's a mirror. How we see her reflects how we see women, leadership, sexuality, and ambition. She survived 2 millennia of slander, simplification, and soft-focus storytelling. And yet, she remains alive in our imagination. Not bad for someone whose enemies tried very hard to delete her from history. When people picture Highland clans in the 12th to 16th centuries, the mind usually conjures up images of burly men in kilts, claymores flashing in the sunlight, bagpipes wailing in the background as tartan-clad warriors charge across misty glens. But here's the thing, they weren't the ones holding everything together. Not really. Behind every dramatic charge and bloody feud, there was a woman, often several, keeping the hearth burning, the estate running, the lineage intact, and the enemies at bay. Clan life in the Highlands was precarious. Men might vanish for weeks or months at a time, gone to battle, political negotiations, or long-distance raiding expeditions. And when they left, who do you think ran the show? Spoiler, not the sheep. Women assumed full command of the household, and in many cases the entire estate. That meant supervising agricultural cycles, livestock management, clan finances, defending property, and making sure the men returned to something more than rubble and chaos. But their strength went beyond the practical. Highland women were custodians of honor, heritage, and resilience. They taught their sons how to be warriors and their daughters how to be fierce in softer ways. They maintained the oral traditions that passed clan legends from generation to generation. They preserved sacred kinship bonds through calculated marriages, powerful alliances, and unyielding loyalty. And when things got especially grim, they didn't just wring their hands and pray. There are recorded instances of women arming themselves and fighting to defend their homes. These weren't just isolated acts of bravery. They were expectations, unspoken but understood. If the men fell, the clan didn't fall with them. The women stood up. It's no exaggeration to say that the Highlands would have collapsed without these women. They weren't background characters in a masculine epic. They were the beating heart of it all. Gritty, strategic, and often overlooked. Think of them not as support roles, but as co-commanders of the Highland way of life. In the rigid world of clan hierarchy, you might expect power to flow in only one direction, downward from the lair of the chieftain, the sword-bearing patriarch. But Highland clans were never that simple. For all their masculine thunder, there was a quiet, calculated current of power that ran parallel to the battlefield, and it was entirely female. Enter the clan matriarch. These women weren't simply the wife of the chief. They were dynastic architects, political operators, and often the de facto rulers of domestic and economic life. While their husbands or sons might have been the public face of the clan, it was the matriarchs who negotiated marriages, brokered peace, and ensured that loyalty within the clan didn't fracture into chaos. In many ways, they held the emotional and strategic glue of the entire system. A Highland woman of noble rank was raised with more than needlework. She was taught land law, estate management, clan politics, and how to read a room full of men drunk on pride and blood feuds. Marriages weren't love matches. They were chess moves. And the matriarch knew how to play the board. When a rival clan extended a marriage proposal, she could see 6 generations ahead. Would the union bring peace, power, land, or trouble? She'd decide, and her voice carried weight. But don't assume they ruled only through words and whispers. If needed, they could turn icy diplomacy into fiery wrath. There are accounts of clan women ordering retaliations, defending keeps during sieges, and publicly shaming oath-breakers. You don't want to end up on a matriarch's bad side, especially not if your fate depended on her favor. And let's not forget their influence within the clan itself. A respected matriarch could control the hearts of warriors more effectively than a chieftain's threats ever could. She wasn't feared. She was revered. When she walked into a gathering, people stood. When she spoke, they listened. And when she made a decision, it was as good as law. In a warrior's world where steel was currency and pride could start wars, Highland women wielded something far more dangerous: permanence. Men could win a fight, but matriarchs, they could win generations. The Highlands weren't exactly known for their convenience. You didn't have a castle full of servants or a court full of administrators. You had weather that wanted to kill you, terrain that defied logic, and a calendar marked by raids, famines, and funerals. And yet somehow estates functioned. Harvest came in, livestock stayed fed. People were clothed, sheltered, and fed. How? Clan women, particularly the ones left in charge while the men gallivanted off to war. Forget the romantic image of a lady spinning flax by the fire. Highland estate management was brutal, physical, and intellectually demanding. A woman might wake before sunrise, oversee the dairy, supervise the seasonal workers, haggle with tenants, and then make sure her own children weren't stabbing each other with eating knives. And if there was a tax due to crown or tithe owed to the church, she'd handle that, too. Usually while nursing an infant and preparing for the next cattle raid. They knew the land better than any surveyor. They could tell if a cow was about calved just by the way it walked. They had to calculate how many oats could be used for food and how much had to be stashed for next year's seed. This wasn't romanticized peasant wisdom. It was logistics politics, and survival rolled into one linen-clad woman with wind-burned cheeks. And just to add a little more spice, if the clan was powerful or wealthy, she also had to manage visiting dignitaries. That meant hospitality, security, and not accidentally poisoning anyone with questionable venison pie. A well-run estate reflected directly on the chief and by extension on her. Oh! And she didn't just manage laborers. She managed men. If her brother-in-law got drunk and refused to work, she disciplined him. If a neighboring tenant tried to swindle her on grain prices, she outnegotiated him. If there was a potential rebellion bubbling up within the ranks, she sniffed it out and stomped it down before it became an actual problem, all while holding the social fabric together with a look, a word, or a strategic silence. Highland men might have brought home the spoils of war, but it was the women who ensured there was still a home to come back to. A clan without a capable estate woman wasn't a clan. It was a slow-motion collapse waiting to happen. When raiders came thundering over the hills or rival clans launched surprise attacks, it wasn't always the men who stood between home and ruin. Sometimes it was a woman in a wool dress armed with a kitchen knife, a musket, or, she was lucky, a proper sword. And she wasn't screaming in fear. She was barking orders. The idea that Highland women simply hid in the back during conflict is charming and completely false. In many clans, women were trained in basic defense from a young age. They knew how to load a firearm, wield a dirk, and stand their ground when the walls trembled. After all, if your husband, father, or sons were off fighting, who else was going to hold the gate? There are documented accounts of women leading the defense of towers, castles, and crofts during clan wars and English incursions. One 16th century story tells a Highland lady who poured boiling oatmeal over invaders scaling her walls. Not exactly glamorous, but highly effective. Another rallied the servants and elderly to hold a siege for days until help arrived. They weren't ornamental. They were tactical. These women understood that home was more than a building. It was identity, legacy, everything the clan stood for. And if that meant facing down armored men while barefoot in the mud, they did it. Not because they were fearless, but because the alternative, loss of land, children taken, culture erased, was worse. They also knew psychological warfare. A furious woman at the head of her household could terrify, would be looters more than a teenage lad with a spear. Some even went so far as to paint their faces, scream like banshees, and throw burning thatch to appear possessed by spirits. Superstition worked wonders when steel didn't, and once the smoke cleared, they didn't collapse in a heap. They picked up the pieces, patched the roof, buried the dead, and got back to work. No medals, no songs, just another Tuesday in the Highlands. To defend the hearth wasn't just about combat. It was about refusing to surrender the soul of the clan. And in that battlefield, Highland women proved over and over that they were far more than caretakers. They were the final line of defense. If you thought clan wars were brutal, trick clan weddings in the Highlands, marriage wasn't about love, candlelight, or wandering to the heather hand in hand. It was business, strategic, ruthless even. And guess who played the sharpest game in this battlefield of bloodlines and alliances? The women. Highland women weren't just passive participants shuffled between clans. They were assets, yes, but also agents. Marriage negotiations were clan diplomacy at its most delicate, and mothers, daughters, and widows often wielded more influence in these discussions than the men who'd be tying the actual knot. A well-made match could end a feud that had lasted for decades. A poorly chosen one could ignite a fresh war before the honeymoon even started. If there was a honeymoon, women, particularly matriarchs and noble daughters, had to calculate risk like military strategists. Was the groom from a strong lineage? Would the union bring cattle, land, or protection? Was the bride's dowry enough to seal the deal without weakening her own clan's position? And once married, the woman's job was just getting started. She had to produce heirs, yes, but also manage the politics of her new home, keep the peace between extended family members, and somehow remain a loyal tie to her original clan without raising suspicions of betrayal. It was a tightrope walk in a storm. But some women didn't just walk it, they danced across it. Historical records speak of wives who acted as secret negotiators between clans, keeping family ties alive behind enemy lines. Others used their marriage to gain information, to influence their husbands' decisions, or to sneak aid to their birth clan when the politics got hot. These weren't soap opera subplots. This was survival. And let's not pretend all marriages were pleasant. Some women used cunning, wit, and the occasional forged letter to escape bad unions or manipulate the outcomes in their favor. Divorce wasn't common, but clever women knew how to bend the rules or make new ones entirely. In the Highland world, where loyalty and legacy defined your worth, a wedding was never just a party. It was a pact, a gamble, and sometimes a battlefield with no armor but your surname. And Highland women, they played to win. In a land where so much was unwritten, memory became power, and women were its guardians. While men chased glory with swords, Highland women wielded a quieter weapon, the word. Through stories, songs, lullabies, and laments, they kept the soul of the clan alive. And in the Highlands, where oral tradition shaped identity, that was no small feat from childhood. Girls were taught the tales of their ancestors, not just for entertainment, but as a living map of clan values, feuds, victories, betrayals, and sacred oaths. These stories weren't idle fireside chatter. They were the unofficial constitution. Forget a name or a wronged alliance, and someone might die in the next cattle raid, because you didn't remember who insulted whom in 1447. Women sang these stories into their children's ears, passed them between generations, and carried them across moors when fleeing war or famine. They were the keepers of genealogies, oral contracts, and cautionary tales. Some became professional bards or seanades, oral historians, especially in Gaelic-speaking areas. Even illiterate, these women held more history in their heads than most lords had in their libraries. But they also knew when not to speak. Highland women mastered the art of strategic silence. In a world riddled with spies, shifting loyalties, and dangerous rumors, knowing what not to say and when could save your life. A wrong word over AE could undo a fragile alliance. A slip of the tongue during prayer could spark suspicion. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a survival skill. And when tragedy struck, women grieved aloud. The coward, a keening lament, was a raw, guttural mourning ritual often led by women. It wasn't just crying. It was performance, protest, and emotional exorcism. These wails could shake a glen, frighten livestock, and remind the world that someone important had fallen. It was part mourning, part myth-making. Through words both spoken and withheld, Highland women ensured the clan's legacy endured beyond war, famine, and forced displacement. Their voices were identity, passed judgment, and warned future generations of old mistakes. Without them, history wouldn't just be forgotten. It would never have been remembered at all. In the wild, weather-beaten highlands far from the polished halls of academia or monastic hospitals. Who do you think delivered babies, healed wounds, calmed fevers, and cursed your enemies for good measure? Spoiler alert, it wasn't a university-trained doctor. It was the woman next door. Highland women were the unofficial healthcare system. Every village had a handful of women who knew which herbs could ease childbirth, which pick uses could draw an infection, and which plants you should definitely not eat unless you wanted your insides to boil. These weren't just housewives with a green thumb. They were skilled practitioners, often with knowledge passed down from mother to daughter for generations. The midwife was the most respected of all. She didn't just catch babies. She carried entire lineages in her hands. She knew when a mother needed coaxing and when to intervene with force. She prepared the home, administered herbal painkillers, and dealt with complications the best she could with no sterile gloves or a backup plan. And when a birth went badly, it was the midwife who stayed behind to clean the blood, bury the child, and comfort the mother. Then there were the healers. They were part botanist, part psychologist, Part sorceress. Got a burn. She had a salve. Bad dreams. She'd smudge the house. Infertility. There was a tea for that, though it probably tasted like pond water. But her real power wasn't in the recipe. It was in the trust she commanded. People believed in her because she had results. Of course, power without a male title came at a cost. These same women could be and often were accused of witchcraft. A healer who failed to cure a chief's son might find herself blamed for the boy's death. A widow too skilled in charms might be seen as dangerous. And yet, despite the risks, the clans relied on them. You didn't fight a war or survive a winter without a wise woman nearby. In a world where men died from infected cuts and childbirth was a coin toss, these women weren't fringe figures. They were vital infrastructure, lifesavers and life-givers. If Highland women kept the culture alive through story, they kept the body alive through skill. Call them witches if you want, but history knows better. They were the Highlanders' first line of medicine, and often their last hope. In the Highland world, death wasn't an if, it was a when. Clan life guaranteed conflict, and conflict meant men died young. But when a husband fell in battle or succumbed to illness, the story didn't end for his widow. In fact, that's when things got interesting. Highland widows weren't expected to retreat into silent mourning. In many cases, they stepped forward into new roles, ones that demanded grit, cunning, and steel nerves. If there were no adult sons to inherit the estate, the widow might temporarily take command. She became the acting head of household, steward of the land, and guardian of her children's inheritance. And she didn't have the luxury of waiting for permission. Many used their status to solidify power. A widow could broker alliances, reinforce loyalties, and even command armed men to defend what was left of her husband's holdings. No one questioned her grief, but they also didn't underestimate her authority. A grieving woman with land, influence, and a sharp tongue was more dangerous than most warlords. But survival wasn't guaranteed. The widow was vulnerable politically, economically, even physically. Rival clans might see her as a soft target. Ambitious in-laws could try to strip her of rights. Even her own kin might pressure her to remarry, for the good of the clan, of course. But smart widows knew how to play the long game. Some refused marriage altogether and held on to their power through widowhood. Others chose their next husband like a general picks a battlefield strategically with one eye on revenge and the other on legacy. And let's be clear, some of them weren't just strategic. They were vengeful. If her husband died in a feud, the widow might rally the clan for retaliation. She might finance a raid, spread propaganda, or simply keep the hatred alive long enough for her sons to act on it. Highland memory was long, and a widow's tongue could keep a blood feud burning for generations. Yet others chose peace. A widow could also be a peacemaker, using her grief as leverage to stop the cycle of violence. She'd host both sides, offer truce through tears, and remind men what war truly cost. In the Highlands, death made widows. But what they did with that title, that made legends. Today, when we remember the clans of the Scottish Highlands, we conjure up tales of blood and broadswords, of tartan banners fluttering against stormy skies, and men with names that echo through battle songs. But the women, the ones who ran the lands, raised the warriors, negotiated the peace, and sometimes even fought the battles, are rarely given more than a footnote. Why? Because their strength wasn't always loud. It didn't always march into battle with a banner. It showed itself in endurance, in running an estate through a blizzard, in burying a husband and then defending the homestead with one hand, and raising a future chief with the other, in staying silent when needed and speaking truth when no man dared. They kept culture alive while cultures tried to erase them. When English rule pushed down Gaelic language and Highland customs, it was often the women who taught the old songs, passed on the legends and identity into lullabies and laments. They did not always resist with swords, but with memory, with the kind of quiet rebellion that survives empires. Even after the fall of the clan system in the 18th century, the legacy of these women remained. You can still find traces in the oral traditions passed down in Hebridean homes, in the superstitions clinging to remote glens, in the sharp wit and sharper will of Highland-descended grandmothers who don't suffer fools no matter how many centuries have passed. But history books are selective. They remember the generals, not the midwives, the chiefs, not the matriarchs, the battles, not the bread baked by a woman during a siege to keep 20 children alive. And yet Highland women left their mark, not in stone monuments, but in survival. The clans endured because of them. Their strength was in continuity, not conquest. Their victories were measured not in heads taken, but in homes saved, children raised, and identities preserved. So, no, they're not gone. They're just buried beneath centuries of war stories written by men. But if you listen carefully in the wind that sweeps the moors or the rhythm of an old Gaelic tune, you'll still hear them, not forgotten, just waiting to be remembered properly. Imagine walking into a grand hall lit by flickering torches and shimmering chandeliers. The scent of roasted pheasant, cinnamon, and orange blossom thick in the air. Tapestries hang like silent witnesses, while gold-rimmed goblets wait to be filled with sweet wine from Sicily. This wasn't dinner. It was declaration. And in the courts of Renaissance Italy, your plate said more about your power than any crown ever could. Overwhelmed with grief, she wept at the foot of the structure. Legend says her crying was so powerful, so sincere that a section of the wall collapsed, revealing his bones beneath. The emperor, upon hearing the story, feared her fury. In some versions, he attempted to make amends by offering her wealth or even marriage. In others, she throws herself into the sea rather than accept the man who caused so much suffering. The tale of Mongengu endured through dynasties. For centuries, people visited temples in her honor, not to celebrate the wall's strength, but to mourn the lives it consumed. Her story turned a national monument into a human tragedy, a reminder that every stone bore the weight of someone's son, husband, or father. While the wall became a symbol of national pride, Mengjiang's tale became a folk protest, a quiet rebellion wrapped in sorrow. Her tears gave a voice to the voiceless, the nameless thousands who toiled and died unseen. And perhaps that's the paradox of the wall. Built to project power, it also reflects pain, glorified by rulers, haunted by ghosts. It stands not just as a line in the sand, but as a line in the soul of China, a place where ambition met anguish, and where a woman's tears once proved stronger than an emperor's stone. In the end, it wasn't just warriors or emperors who shaped the wall. It was moorers, too. The Great Wall under Qin Shi Huang was not the longest, nor the strongest, nor the most visually impressive version of the barrier we know today. But it was the first to dare imagine the unthinkable. A single colossal spine, protecting a unified China from the chaos beyond. That ambition would echo through history. Qin's wall was raw, made of dirt, sweat, and command. It lacked the architectural finesse of the Ming dynasty's later renovations with their stone bricks and crenellated battlements. But the concept was born here. The idea that China could draw a literal line across the northern frontier and say, "This is us." That is not more than just a military innovation. It was a psychological boundary, a cultural statement, and a declaration of identity. The wall said that inside was order, laws, roads, coins, standard script. Outside was disorder, tribes on horseback, shifting loyalties, and the unknown. For Qin Shi Huang, who spent years crushing rival kingdoms into submission, that clarity mattered. But there's something deeper. The wall also became a model for how power is remembered. As much as it was about defending a border, it was about projecting strength, imperial strength, even centuries after the emperor's body turned to dust. Later dynasties followed the blueprint, not just structurally, but ideologically. They too built, they too defended, they too understood that a wall isn't just stone, it's story. Today, tourists walk along the gleaming brick trails of the Ming Wall near Beijing. But few realize that underneath it all, sometimes literally, lies the ancient, compacted earth of Qin's original path. What began as an emperor's desperate solution to northern raids became a living, breathing symbol of Chinese endurance. And that legacy lives on. The Great Wall is more than a monument. It's a contradiction. It protected and it imprisoned. It unified and it oppressed. It gave structure to a nation and buried thousands in its foundations. But it lasted. So while Qin Shi may have failed in his quest for immortality through magic or alchemy, he succeeded in a different way. His wall didn't grant him eternal life, but it made him eternally relevant. Long after his name was feared, erased, then resurrected. The wall remains a boundary, a legacy, a scar that turned into a spine.